President Trump met with a bipartisan group of members of Congress to talk about gun legislation. Next, Senators Chris Murphy and John Cornyn talk about gun policy and discuss trying to make changes to the National Instant Background Check System.
Colleagues, I hope we rise to the moment before us and get something done to try to make this country safer over the course of the next week or two. I'm going to be glad to go and join the president in a few hours to hear more about his thoughts on how we can put the safety of our kids ahead of any political considerations and try to figure out how to make sure that Parkland is the last. As I have told some of the kids who've come into my office from Parkland, the ripples of grief will never, ever end there. In Newtown, Connecticut, that place has been fundamentally changed. When you lose that many young lives in a short period of time, there is no true recovery. And unfortunately, Parkland will find that, as Charleston did, as Orlando did, and so many before them. But we need to remember that while the country tends to pay attention to the epidemic of gun violence when there is a mass shooting, this is an epidemic that doesn't take a day off. Yesterday, likely 80 to 90 people died from gunshot wounds. The majority of those were suicides. That is an epidemic in and of itself. A chunk of those were accidental shootings. Another chunk of those were gun homicides. But the rate of gun death in this country just has no parallel anywhere else in the world. There's not another first world nation that has the rate of gun violence that we do. In fact, it's not even close. The rate of gun violence in this country is 20 times higher than the average in the OECD. So we got to remember that when we try to craft a public policy response here, it can't just be about school shootings. You're much more likely to die from an accidental gunshot than you are in a school shooting. And so we've got to be comprehensive in our approach, which is why the Fix Nic Act just isn't good enough. I'm proud that Senator Cornyn and I and many others in this body came together to put forward a piece of legislation that will improve the background check system. It will make sure that more people that shouldn't buy guns aren't able to buy guns. But it's a relatively modest, not relatively, it is a modest change. And in fact, it's really just about making sure that people that are in law enforcement and inside the NICS system comply with existing law. It doesn't actually add any new background checks. It doesn't solve the gun show loophole, doesn't solve the internet loophole. So my hope is that we can bring this bill before the Senate, but then we can have a debate on other measures that might enjoy bipartisan support that will do 10 times more than Fix Nic to keep this country safe. Let's talk about expanding background checks to make sure that everybody that is buying a gun in a commercial sale has to prove that they're not a criminal, prove that they are not seriously mentally ill. Let's talk about the experience that Connecticut and Indiana have had in allowing courts to use protective orders to take away guns from people that are showing evidence of doing harm to the people around them. Let's have a conversation about whether or not we think it's right for people to be able to walk into schools with a gun equipped with a 30-round or 100-round magazine. I don't know if any of those measures will get 60 votes, but I think we owe it to the American people to not limit debate, to not shut down debate in the United States Senate chamber. I know it's probably a scary thing for some Republicans that votes are changing. Many of my Republican colleagues have acknowledged that they may be thinking about supporting things today that they might not have supported before. And because minds are changing, it behooves us to make sure that we have a full debate on the floor of the United States Senate. So I'm supportive of the bill that Senator Cornyn and I have worked on. I hope that it can become the foundation of a much more comprehensive set of measures that we take a look at in the coming days. And I think you got to pay attention to where the American public is on this issue. I understand polls shouldn't dictate all the decisions that we make here. We pay attention to public opinion. We respond to it more often than not, but it doesn't guide every single decision that we make here because public opinion changes. But on this issue, it's been a slow and steady build. The number of Americans saying that the United States Congress bears responsibility for the epidemic of mass slaughter in this country because we have not changed a single gun law, except to make them weaker since Sandy Hook. Remember, the only thing that this body has done on guns since Sandy Hook is to allow hundreds of thousands of seriously mentally ill people to get weapons. Passed that law last year, signed by the president. Nothing to actually strengthen gun laws. Record numbers of Americans want us to take action. 97% of Americans want us to pass universal background checks. Apple pie isn't as popular as background checks are in this country today. No other public policy that we are considering gets a 97% approval rating from the American public other than universal background checks. Let's listen to them. Let's listen to them. I'd encourage Senator McConnell to not limit debate, to not constrain the Senate. Let's use this week and next week to try to come up with a set of measures that we can debate and have up or down votes on. And let's hope, in the meantime, the president fleshes out what he is for and what he is against. The president tweeted that he supports comprehensive background checks. Maybe later today we'll find out if that's really true. Comprehensive background checks tends to mean closing the loopholes that exist. But hopefully the president can help lead us to a conclusion that is something much more than Fix Nic. As my colleague from Florida who lived through the last several mass shootings in his state remarked, Fix Nic is just simply not enough to meet this moment. I hope we build upon it in the coming days. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I understand there's a bill at the desk that's due for a second reading.
The senator's correct. The clerk will read the title of the bill for a second time.
S-2464, a bill to improve border security and so forth.
In order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my colleague from Connecticut is here in the room and mentioned the bill that we've been working on together, the Fix Nic bill. I just want to remind all of us what the motivation was, at least on my part, for introducing this legislation, and express my gratitude to the senator from Connecticut, as well as the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, and others who have co-sponsored this legislation. It was just a few short months ago when someone murdered 26 people worshiping in a small church just outside San Antonio in Sutherland Springs. He had purchased these firearms, having lied on the background check when they asked him whether he was a convicted felon, whether he was honorably discharged from the military, whether he'd ever committed and convicted of domestic violence. He lied. If he had told the truth, he would have been prohibited from buying those firearms, and perhaps, perhaps, he would have been dissuaded, slowed down, or perhaps not at all, would not have committed that terrible atrocity that day where 26 people lost their lives and 20 more that were killed or were injured. Come to find out that the Air Force, which had convicted him of those two offenses, domestic violence and the felony, they failed to upload the information that was required in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. If they had, then he would not have gotten away with lying, because the FBI background check system would have revealed the truth. I can tell you that I have the utmost confidence that if the Fix Nic law were in effect at the time he was attempting to purchase those firearms, in all likelihood, he would have been prohibited from purchasing those guns. And I would conclude from that, lives would have been saved, and lives that were changed forever because of the terrible injuries that the other 20 received, that their lives would not have changed in such a terrible way. I told myself at the time, I said, I can't go to another church service. We went to the church that met in a tent just down the street from the church where the shooting took place a week after the shooting. The pastor and his wife, who lost their teenage daughter, were there. The wife was distraught, as you can imagine. The pastor summoned a power that is greater than human power to preach that day. And it was emotional, it was inspirational, but it's a terrible tragedy. And I told myself that day that I would never wish to look another family in the face and say that we failed to do everything that was within our power to prohibit or to stop something like that from happening again. And Fix Nic, as I think people who are familiar with it understand, basically takes the law as it currently exists and makes sure that it's applied, and that people like this shooter at Sutherland Springs can't lie their way out of it and get access to firearms and ruin people's lives in the process. So I realize that it may not be as comprehensive as some people would like. The problem is around here, if you ignore the things that you can agree on and just look to fight about things you can't agree on, nothing ever happens. No problems ever get solved. And I think a good place to start would be to pass this bipartisan Fix Nic piece of legislation. And I hope our colleagues would consider. I understand they have a different view on some aspects of guns, but what we had here was a catastrophic failure. We had a systemic failure. The school system failed. The mental health authorities failed. The local law enforcement and federal law enforcement failed. Our society failed to provide the tools to identify people who cry out, in essence, on social media, like this young man did when he posted on YouTube, essentially the threat that he actually carried out, which is he was going to go shoot up a school. When that was referred to the FBI, they didn't follow up on it, and nothing ever happened. And looking at the young man, he was sending signals out on a regular basis that he was a ticking time bomb, and people were going to get hurt and potentially die, as they did. So I would hope that rather than leave here this week with nothing to show for our efforts, we would at least agree to pass what enjoys broad bipartisan support, and to perhaps prevent another shooting like that occurred at Sutherland Springs. The President's made clear, thinking now about the Las Vegas shooting, that he believes that bump stocks ought to be regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I agree with that. So those are two things we could do, perhaps, that might save lives in the future. But to just say it's not enough, we want to do more, and to fail to do what's within our grasp, which we can agree to me seems like a bizarre way of doing business. And I think it's an abdication of our responsibility. I don't want to see another family who's lost a loved one as a result of one of these mass shootings that might be prevented by some action we might take on Fix Nic or the bump stock issue, for example. There may be other things we need to do. We have done some things tried to address the mental health challenges that people like Adam Lanza's mother had. Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, was obviously mentally ill, but he wouldn't accept the treatment that his doctor prescribed. What we did last December, during the Obama administration, passed something called the 21st Century Cures Act, which included a bill that I sponsored called the Mental Health and Safe Communities Act, which encouraged the use of assisted outpatient treatment. So for example, if Adam Lanza's mother couldn't handle her son, he wouldn't take his medication, he wouldn't comply with doctor's orders, she could go to court, a civil court, and essentially get a court order requiring him to comply with his doctor's orders and to take his medication. Again, I'm not suggesting any one of these in isolation or a panacea, but there are things we can do step by step, bit by bit, to reduce the likelihood that these terrible mass shootings occur in the future.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise this afternoon, and I know I'll be joined by a number of my colleagues on the floor to talk about gun violence and to talk about what happened most recently and tragically in the state of Florida. I hope we can cover a number of aspects of this challenge, but I wanted to start, of course, with the victims who were killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School on February the 14th. I'll make reference to the individuals more specifically a little later, but of course we're remembering them today. We're thinking of their families, certainly thinking as well of the surviving students, and praying for the families, the victims, and the survivors. I can't imagine what these families are dealing with right now, just days after this tragedy. There are a lot of ways to express grief, a lot of ways to somehow articulate the loss. I can't do it adequately, so I'll turn to, in this case, a songwriter, a recording artist, Bruce Springsteen. We all know a good bit of his music, but years ago he wrote, after 9/11, the lyrics to a song which was entitled "You're Missing." And of course it has application for those who have loved and lost, especially in this instance so tragically. Bruce Springsteen's words go in part like this. The refrain of the song is, "You're missing." At one point he says, "You're missing when I turn out the lights, you're missing when I close my eyes, and you're missing when I see the sunrise," giving us a sense of the loss all day, all night, every night, for that family member. He was speaking, of course, or reflecting upon the losses of 9/11, but of course anyone who's lost a loved one, especially this way, in this case victims of murder in a school, must be thinking the same about what is missing in their lives and who is missing in their life, whether it's a son or a daughter or another loved one. Gun violence in our country is all too common. It's almost hard to comprehend how common it's become. And unfortunately, it's all too common not just for our country, but especially for the younger generation. I won't provide lines of demarcation, but a lot of young people have known little else in their young lives but reading about or seeing on television stories about gun violence or being in the midst of an act of gun violence. At least hundreds of Americans have been in schools that have been the victims or have been the site of gun violence in the last 20 years or so. What we ought to do here is, in addition to giving speeches and pointing out where we should go, that's That's helpful, I guess. But the most important thing the United States Senate can do is to debate and vote. Debate and vote. I would prefer we would debate one bill, one idea, and then vote on it. And then have another debate on another bill and vote on that. And do that again and again and again. See where we end up. I think anyone here, most people here would be willing to do that, even if we knew the result. Even if you could prove to us that this particular measure will not pass, or this one will be close, or that one might pass. Whatever the circumstance, we should debate this issue. That's what this institution is supposed to be all about. Open debate on the issues of the day. That's what I think not only young people across the country, but people of all ages are expecting of us. They expect us to debate and vote and keep trying to pass a measure that might reduce or maybe even substantially reduce the likelihood of further gun violence in schools and all other kinds of places in our society. But of course, we're thinking particularly about schools, where students should have a reasonable, or I should say have, but sometimes cannot be sure of a reasonable expectation of security. I can't imagine this as a student in all the years I was in school. We never even thought about this as a reality in our lives. Never thought about it for 1 minute, probably, someone my age. People who grew up in the 1960s or 70s or 80s never thought about this. It's only in the last generation or so that students have had to worry about, think about, and unfortunately some experience this kind of violence. I was a teacher for 1 year. I was a volunteer in North Philadelphia of a fifth grade classroom. I only taught for a year and knew I would only be teaching for a year of volunteer work, but I never thought about this. I can't imagine what I would do. Even if I had some training in law enforcement, even if I had some training in how to handle a weapon, I can't even imagine having to defend a classroom against this kind of killer with a high-powered weapon where he can shoot bullets one after another into a classroom. Can't even imagine it, and most people can't. Schools are supposed to be places of teaching, of learning, of friendship, of competition, of engagement with all kinds of activities in a school. And of course, schools are supposed to be places of growth, where young people start a year or start their 4 years in high school or grade school, high school for 4 years, grade school for longer, but come through that and grow into the kind of person that their families hope they would be. Schools should not be places of fear and of trepidation and of uncertainty about what might happen in that school. That's not a common thought that students in years past had, that they would go to school and not be safe, that they would go to school and potentially not come home. What's been heartening and inspiring in the aftermath of this tragedy is what young people have done in Parkland, in the state of Florida, and frankly throughout the country. One of my colleagues the other day said something which made a lot of sense, made the statement that the Senate is not where the focus of attention is. This senator said the focus of attention is on these young people. They are leading. In this case, Congress might have to follow, but we should follow them. They are leading on this. They are showing us the way. Young people are charting a new course on this issue, and they're not going to go away. They're going to be voting for 50 more years or longer. They're not going away, and this issue won't go away. So they are leading us, and we should follow them. And they and their families expect us to act. And that means debating and voting. Doesn't just mean giving speeches or expressing condolence. So many of us were moved and inspired by their leadership, and we continue to be so inspired. So many of us were moved to tears and outpourings of emotion on all of these tragedies. I can remember, I'll never forget what I was thinking and responding to when it came to the Newtown massacre, Sandy Hook Elementary School. That, for me, was a seminal moment in my life in the United States Senate. That tragedy informed how I would vote going forward. That tragedy moved me to take a different approach to these issues, and frankly, to vote a different way starting in 2012 and 2013 in the aftermath of that tragedy. And the one question I had to ask myself at the time, and I think we're still asking ourselves, tragedy after tragedy, is there nothing? Is there nothing? Is there no action the Congress of the United States can take that will reduce the likelihood of gun violence, that will substantially reduce the likelihood of gun violence in a classroom, in a school? Is there no action that the most powerful country in the history of the human race can take to reduce this likelihood? If our answer is no, then I guess that's the way some will vote, and they will move on to other issues. I don't think many Americans believe that. I think most Americans believe there are actions we can take. It won't be one bill or one amendment or one vote, but there are a series of steps we can take that over time, and it will take too much time, but we have to start now to consider, debate, and vote on a number of measures. At the time of Sandy Hook, and I want to turn to my colleagues in just a moment, I should say at the time after the Sandy Hook Elementary tragedy, I was, as many of us were, reading about these young children in the horror of that classroom. And I just happened to tear out a newspaper page, in this case from the Wall Street Journal. These were printed in all kinds of newspapers across the country. You can't see it from a distance, but it's a yellowed copy of that page. It's the Wall Street Journal dated December 17th, 2012, page A6. And the title of this, or the inscription above it, is "Shattered Lives." Pictures of the students, not every student, and pictures of their teachers and others in the school as well, all victims of gun violence. I won't go through the stories, but these are powerful stories of their lives. And we have to ask ourselves, in the aftermath of that kind of a tragedy, just like the most recent tragedy, are we going to celebrate their lives and tell the world how much they contributed to the life of America, but then in the same breath say, but we have to move on to another issue? I don't think that's an American approach. I don't think that's the approach of a great nation, of a great people. When we're at our best, we tackle problems. We know that it'll take a long time. We know it'll take a number of votes and a number of actions, but we got to begin. And I think we should begin in this instance. So I'm not going to go through all of the names, or all of the names from every tragedy, of course, but let me just read the first names of the victims of Parkland. And I know the senior senator from Florida, because of his concern for these victims and their families and his knowledge of his home state, will go into even more detail. But I'll just read first names. And we should, as we're reading them, think about what can we do? What should we do as a people? Or should we just do what's happened too many other times and move on? Alyssa, Scott, Martin, Nicholas, Aaron, Jamie, Chris, Luke, Kara, Gina, Joaquin, Elena, Meadow, Helena, Alex, Carmen, and Peter. 17 individuals who are missing now in the lives of their family, missing from what their classmates are experiencing every day, missing from the lives of those classmates, sometimes their best friend, sometimes their brother, in the family context, the brother or the sister, or the son or the daughter. So, as the songwriter says, those 17 are missing when they shut out the lights, they're missing when they close their eyes at night, and they're missing when they see the sunrise. And we have an obligation. We are duty-bound as an institution, but maybe more importantly as a people, to take action. The time is now. Maybe not to finish action, but the time is now to take action. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, as the senator from Pennsylvania is leaving,